to see the unseen, to know the unknown, to set forth in search of knowledge. This has been the goal of man since the beginning of time.
Men come into existence and pass away not by their own choice and decision, but by an overwhelming power beyond their comprehension.
The subject of prophets and prophecy might come across as somewhat obscure, maybe something solely for the intrigue of a theologian. But when it's pointed out that the major religions of the world at large are completely brought forward by prophets, then one might start to wonder a bit more. And if you then point out how many modern events have been orchestrated by ancient prophecies, then one might be even more intrigued to learn more about this prophetic motif. But in studying this motif across comparative religion, comparative mythology, you start to kick up the dust of something even more profound than this. Something that may just answer some of the most fundamental mysteries of prehistory. So let's ask, what is a prophet? What is the nature of prophecy? What are its implications? What are its mechanisms? And perhaps most importantly, what wisdom might this provide us in the modern day? Etymologically speaking, prophet doesn't glean us too much. Prophet simply means to speak ahead of time, or one who's speaking from before. The baseline and ready association of this subject matter lends itself to the Abrahamic faiths. So this is where we'll begin then. Curiously, we should note the distinctions between Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is a distinction of who we designate are the prophets, or are not false prophets, or just simply those that were inspired but not true prophets, so forth. Who we say is the one that carries the message from the divine would dictate which faith that we would follow. There are certain distinctions in each of these given religions of who is a more important prophet, who's a less important prophet. For instance, there's the former prophets, the latter prophets in Judaism. The main prophets between Christianity and Judaism that are held up are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Both more or less would subscribe to the mutual belief that there are 12 minor prophets as well. By comparison, Islam is not as selective or takes more liberties with who it designates as prophets. For instance, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad are all viewed as prophets, canonical prophets. Some would point out how the Quran lists 25 prophets. Others would go so far as to say there's 124,000 different prophets throughout history. So then we should start to wonder what then designates someone as a prophet. And it's a question of if what they said came to be true. And in which case, if we look to the Bible proper, then the fall of Tyre, the fall of Babylon, Christians at large would go so far as to say that every prophecy in the Bible has come true, with exception to Revelations. And accordingly, if Revelations hasn't become true yet, then that would mean that it's not quite prophetic yet. And accordingly, the one who wrote that work is not yet a prophet. But that's only if we're being technical about it. When it comes to the Quran, there are a number of verses that are quite convincing in their prophetic authenticity. For instance, the prophesizing of fingerprints, the prophesizing of a future with pollution, even going so far as prophesizing the nature of cars and vehicles. So in this way, those that come to constitute Scripture for this Abrahamic religion, are those that were viewed to be authentic channels or authentic voices for God or Allah or the divine. Then there would be several others whom were false prophets. So whoever is earnestly receiving this message, and then we have to additionally trust that the person that received this message put it down exactly as it was given. And we won't necessarily wonder about the intention of that individual. For instance, are we to believe that works such as Leviticus and Deuteronomy are simply that, a direct word from the divine, and that they are not ever infringed upon by political interests? Are we to say that the works of the prophets have always been, in each scripture, 100% uninvolving of themselves? If we do assume this, then we can assume that the works therein are 100% the gospel. But this whole subject matter brings up a number of very reasonable questions. And that is, do prophets continue? Did the voice shut off? And this isn't an outright discussion in Christianity. It varies between these Abrahamic beliefs, but we'll take the example of Christianity for this. One school of thought would be a sort of cessationism, where the belief, whether said aloud or unconsciously, is that it stopped. It stopped, and once the Bible was written, and once it was compiled, and once the right people chose which books were the right gospel, then it stopped. And no reason to go on. That's one argument. And then there's the continuationists. And that would be to say that the prophetic gifts are still among us, and that they have never stopped. The early Christians, almost without exception, believed this to be the case. It seemed like a much later development of Christianity to have this overall philosophy. And it is convenient. Once you have built a power structure, and once the Second Temple of Nicaea had put together the book that it liked the best, then any future prophets would make things quite messy. And you can see why Islam then is a bit of a taboo in this category. You can't add another prophet. That's the assumption. Or that person isn't a prophet. That's the underlying assumption. Same with Mani from Manichaeanism. In early Christianity, Montanus claimed to be a prophet. And of course, they would say that Montanus very much wasn't a prophet. And we're going to get rid of all the people that think so that we can go on continuing that he wasn't a prophet. This is just to say that there is a fundamental assumption in the status quo flavor of Christianity that this is all cessationism. There are some more fringe groups, say for instance the Pentecostals, that believe that these gifts are still among us, and thus they believe in the power of glossolalia, the speaking of tongues, the direct Holy Ghost intervening in our personable lives. And you can see why the power structure at large of Christianity would not allow this slippery slope to exist, because then all of a sudden, well, what about Joseph Smith? Was he an earnest prophet? Did he earnestly, directly receive the word from the divine? And better yet, let's ask, what about the specificities of how the Bible puts this forward? In the sense of why in certain prophetic visions is God giving it directly to the prophet, and why in other prophetic instances are they being given by angels? Are they two distinctive types? Is there a difference? Is one more authentic than the other? Why would God have it as a requirement to move through a messenger, that being an angel, instead of always giving it directly? What exactly is the nature of receiving a prophecy? If we speak plainly, it does seem quite strange, if not outright silly, to say that only in a very specific part of the world during a very specific era of history did the all-pervasive deity decide to speak to people directly. That seems very odd. So to flesh this out some more, let's entertain the inspirations of Christianity. After all, much of what became Christianity was directly inspired from Zoroastrianism. And in Zoroastrianism, that all began because Zoroaster had a prophetic experience. He had a noetic ecstasis. He brought about a vision so powerful that it ended up creating scripture, and it ended up creating a sort of proto-world religion. After all, in the Nativity, the Magi are present, previously discussed in the course. And what is one of the main gifts of the Magi? What is one of the main skills that holds them in such high regard in the ancient past? It's prophecy. Being able to discern prophecy through astrology and through dream interpretation. And thus, two interesting forms of how these prophetic gifts are given. If angels are constellatory, then that would mean to look in the heavens and to see the signs of the stars would be a sort of prophetic experience. Or is that going too far? On the other end, it's very canonical to think, yes, the prophets do receive dream visions. But then if we dial it back to the Magi and the Zoroastrians, then this is a very flushed out science, something that's been inherited into the deep past, all the way from Mesopotamia back into shamanism. So at the very least, it seemed for a good long while, there had been people receiving prophetic signs and prophetic dreams, overall prophetic experiences, well before even Judaism had its fledgling beginnings. The term for prophet or prophecy in Hebrew etymologically roots back to Akkadian. And in Akkadian, it's a word for a seer. And that word has a more sorcery-like bend to it. The seer isn't just one who divines, but also one who is thought to be a visionary. And there's that word again, vision, a visionary, to get a vision of the future that most assuredly will come to pass. When we look at the wider scope of this subject matter, then we start to notice there's some really blurry boundaries to entertain here. Often the title or the act of experiencing something prophetic was a sort of madness or understood as an out-of-body rapturous experience, like you are channeling a god directly. Such was certainly the case with the infamous oracles at Delphi. And there's another word for us, seemingly distinct from prophet, maybe for a reason. The word oracle. What does oracle mean? Well, oracle simply means the agency or medium of a god, a channel, someone who is a messenger of a deity. Notably, the ancient Greeks understood that the nature of poetry, the nature of poetics, and the nature of prophecy were very strangely intertwined. And we do see hints of this in the modern day. For instance, the uncanny similarity of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories and real factual events that happened after his time. It seems as though one who is tapped into the poetic is nearing the realm of the prophetic. But we'll return to this some more later. Let's get back to the oracles. We should also note the relationship between prophecy and political power, because that is very much the podium that the oracles of Delphi offered. The political power was very interested in the future, in making bets, in knowing where to put its aims. We should also notice the cultural difference of affording this work of prophecy to women as opposed to men. We can see clearly in the Abrahamic tradition that this is something for men. But with the Greeks, the women are the ones that ought to do so. So we might just observe that this is very much a cultural choice. Who is the appointed word of the divine? For the Greeks' religious and cultural backing, it's very natural that women ought to be the prophets, because the Fates are women. And the Fates are women because they come from Nyx, that primordial goddess of the night. And that night offers stars, and those stars offer insights via astrology and signs. And the stars, or the heavens, inform everything that happens on the earth. This is the ancient belief. So accordingly, we ascribe that to the feminine, night to the feminine, and thus the Fates to the feminine. That's just one way of explaining the engenderment of the Fates. A notable difference between these oracles and the aforementioned prophets is that these oracles are soliciting this experience. This isn't an involuntary happening. They have a ritual that brings this about, that invites this vision in. They would channel the god Apollo to do so. So let's take some time here and talk about the nature and historical basis for spiritual communication. This act of channeling goes well back into the shamanic and is a staple within paganism as well. This practice might sound very exotic or strange or scary, but if you want to get amped up when you're going to play sports or go to the gym, you might just listen to some music that brings that about. Or as an actor, you might think certain thoughts that bring that emotion to the forefront of your being. This is in the same way a spiritual contact. It is not stranger than this in reality. Every day can be a day of channeling. The key difference is removing yourself completely to become a vessel for this archetype invited, but also in the nature of actually experiencing spiritual communication through ritual, astral projection, so forth. In variant faiths across the world, the word from above, or the word from those on other planes of being, tend to be very ambiguous. The interests of said spirits are not the interests of humans. They are living on different planes. And so accordingly, the way of expressing this direct word from the divine, however and whomever is defining that, tends to be very ambiguous or allegorical. The illustration of a dream is very apropos for this. A dream isn't going to make it clear exactly what it's trying to say to you. It has a roundabout way of doing so. In the ancient shamanic traditions, they understood that allegory is the medium for wisdom and is the medium by which humans and higher sacredness, divinity, can communicate with each other. And so here is allegory as it tends to appear in prophecy. This ambiguity of how to interpret it, and is it actually being prophetic, or are we just kind of seeing it in a different way? This is the nature of how the word is received. For instance, in Isaiah, the author could just come out and say that there will be a fall of a dynasty. A dynasty will end, and there will be the destruction of this religious community, of this community among these people. But instead, we're going to get the stars have fallen, the heavens were rolled up, the sun was blackened, and the earth was devastated and quaked. Notice it's more figurative, it's more dramatic, it's more sideways. It's not stating these things outright. This is not the nature of the word. Such has certainly been argued in the case of Nostradamus, the most infamous of, let's just say, non-canonical prophets. Regular people giving Nostradamus a lot of credo in this respect, although Nostradamus himself was an astrologer. And to protect himself, one might assume to protect himself, he converts to Christianity. And he adamantly expresses several times throughout his life that you should not call him a prophet. I am not a prophet. And that just goes to show the distinction between the loftiness that comes along with a prophet and that word and its associations, and the words such as diviner or seer or soothsayer. These all have different connotations, associations. So then, let's ask a broader question. Is this all involuntary? Does an involuntary vision make it authentic? Is it then only inauthentic if a vision or a noetic experience is solicited? Does it make it impure somehow? Or is the impurity of such an experience only if you put your ego into that experience? We often, many of us, I would hope, not just me alone, have experienced some ineffable situations in life. Whether our dreams have given us a small prophecy of our own lives, or whether a sort of deja vu event has informed us as to something that will soon be happening, or makes us feel a full circle sort of divinity in our own lives. The ancients certainly believed that soliciting this sort of prophetic experience had something to do with the imaginative faculty. There are a number of scholars in the Middle Ages that pushed this very idea, that it is something that happens in accordance with natural law. There is a natural, organic happening of this world that brings about prophetic, noetic experiences to anybody, at least theoretically. This is an interesting era for this level of speculation, because a number would point out how prevalent apparitions are in these noetic, prophetic experiences, that there tends to be a shape or almost a paranormal sort of occurrence that comes along with this. This bleeds back into that older idea of our ancestors coming to give us wisdom, coming into our lives from the other side, from the other plane, to give us some sort of crucial information. But is this different? Is a question. Is this valid and is this different? That's another question for us. Another author would question how authentic we could ever be in attempting to express the ineffable divine experiences that happen to us, and thus calls into question the validity of anybody who's ever written down such works. Because are words capable of capturing the essence of the divinity? Is it capable of orchestrating this world in the way that divinity would want? Because words are fickle. They leave a lot for interpretation, and thus come out as ambiguous, or it isn't quite landing with most people, or only certain people see it in the way that we think it ought to be seen. And in this, it's very much like a dream. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to experience the dream, and it's another thing to hear someone tell you about their dream. And this is interesting in regards to the more holistic approach to the nature of prophecy. Because across the world, these prophetic dreams are flavored by their cultural language. What I mean by that is if we are Christian or Judaic, then if we are to have this divine experience and we are to translate that into words that are appropriate to our culture, then clearly we'll say things like God, angel, so forth. Now, if we're over in ancient China, then the occurrence of having prophetic dreams that utilize the language of the I Ching is there. And accordingly, that dream language is necessary for the prophecy to be spoken. If we have been raised with astrology as a language of discussing archetypes, then it would very likely be that our dreams would then show us something astrological in order to communicate what it's seeking to communicate. If we wish to entertain this subject as earnest and as objective, then we might wonder the variant ways that this has appeared to people throughout time, throughout these different, let's just say, mental languages. How they could come across as bestial, or how they might come across as chimeric. And if so, then what would modern dreams look like in this fashion? What would the prophetic, ineffable, noetic experience look like in the modern sense? Well, the question there would be, do we have a proper language of interpretation for this material? Or do we have the proper means to cope with or communicate this message? Or are we in any way fit to receive this sort of experience? Regardless of when or who or how this may have come across, the best person to receive this sort of experience would be somebody who is very apt in communicating advanced subject matter. And thus, this previous statement of those who have the imaginative faculties. Because it's not just a question of how to receive, but it's also a question of how to convey this, how to be that messenger. Who is a good messenger? Or, additionally, that they came up in a culture that disallowed these experiences to be expressed or to be received and to not be killed, excommunicated, chastised, what have you, for expressing these things. Of course, in the modern sense, this would be a quick trip to a psychiatric ward. But let's step back a bit on this. Let's step back from the dream experiences too, because we've registered that this is a form, a categorical form for the way that these ineffable prophetic experiences come to people. But it's not the only form. There's not only the sleeping dream, there's the waking dream, or the divine coming to an individual involuntarily or ritualistically in their waking life. Might bring about inspired actions to commit to things that you didn't consciously know that you were to commit to, or words that seem to spill out from your mouth that you did not have the previous conscious building of, if that makes sense. There are also voices that may come across. This is well documented into the ancient past. The voices that seemingly are of other, that are informing you or guiding you in a living or dream experience. And then there is the distinct form of a revelation or a great realization where you have come to understand something significant and spontaneously. So in this, how would you put to words the implications of that of which you have just now realized? This, call it divine experience, this very special experience that you've come to spontaneously, has implications that are challenging to share with even your most significant other. So this voice that comes to you, how would you call it, depending on what culture you're in? If this voice comes to you, you might call it an angel. You might call it God. You might call it one of your ancestors. You might call it an ascended master. You might call it what exactly? And that's the dream language issue. That's the cultural language issue. So in the instance that this occurrence, this special occurrence comes and it informs you something about the future, and this is something that you just so happen to communicate with other people, and it gets put down in a book, and then it becomes real, all those qualifiers would be necessary to designate you with a certain special word. But if it doesn't have implications to other people, it wasn't expressed to other people, or it just didn't simply have something to do with the future specifically, then it's not designated with this special word and is in fact usually reserved for words that are less positively associated. Diviner, seer, soothsayer, so forth. But all of this, in bringing up all of this, and reserving most of this conversation for the Western tradition, all of it comes from animism and shamanism. This is not something that just sprung about in the Middle East. This is something that is in the fabric of all indigenous cultures across the world and can be found thusly. The gift of foresight, as it has been a long trope in our ancestry. Who it's given to or how it's brought about is understood differently depending on the culture. When it comes to the Americas, people are more readily familiar with the prophecies of the Inca, of the Maya, and of the Hopi, and each of these respective cultures would deserve their own respective spiritual studies course on this subject. But since this is a broad session on the subject, then we're going to speak broadly about the approach of these cultures given the nature of prophecy. It's worthy of pointing out that these cultures have notable historic figures that are prized for their prophetic abilities. That they were the ones that gave this prophecy and it came true, and thus they are remembered in such a way. It's almost as though they too had their own prophets. It is to say that if we've ever taken any of these prophecies seriously, then we implicitly believe in that word given from the divine, or that nameless individuals, often nameless individuals in the past, have been granted some sort of direct experience of some higher intelligence. And culturally, in indigenous communities, this is much more afforded for. This is much more a part of the grain of society, the expectations of the world. This is not something that would be treated as contentious. A new prophet wouldn't threaten the structure of a long-withheld religious institution. They wouldn't have to create a whole new religious institution and name because a new prophet came along. This new prophecy would simply just add to the previous canon that had been forming through the living word. Not to mention that the people in given culture would be much more open and able to reciprocate these individual experiences with the divine. Albeit if they're small, albeit if they're big, they're all going to understand or have a better cultural understanding of that otherwise thought to be strange experience. But there's a very distinctive difference in flavor, in orientation of native prophecy versus, let's just say, Abrahamic prophecy. Because in this way, the Abrahamic revelation would be the end times. When it comes to the native prophecies in regards to the end times, it is notably more optimistic in the sense that it's not something thought to be this pitfall over the edge into heaven or oblivion. It is said to be a time of great change. This time of great change is transformative. This is not the first world. This is the fourth world, so forth. And in which case it would be moving on to a new world. These changing of timelines, so to speak. The orientation of how to interpret the inherited deep visions into the future. The native mentality is much more predisposed towards life being like a wheel or a circle, or things having a season, things working in phases, as opposed to this more nihilistic blunder at the end of it all sort of approach. They are much more apt to speak about restoration and transformation than annihilation. So there might be something to be said about if these variant cultures have experienced the same prophecy, what would they take away from that prophecy given? It's another intriguing line to all this. Stepping away from that, in earnest, native prophecies are layered and very considerable. The number of very distinctive things that have been prophesized and come to be true in native traditions goes, I think, overall undermentioned. In all the research that I've committed to this subject, I'm certainly not one to say that, of course, all prophecies have credo, but I think there are just enough of them to give way to a great mystery. I think it's all too common for people who have never looked into these subjects to just plainly dismiss them all outright as wishful thinking, or you get a good guess sometimes, right? But in earnest, when you go through the history of prophecy and you see what has been said and what can be intuited and what has been called ahead of time, it starts to scratch away at something very uncanny. And if this is true, then there is a huge implication about this subject that we really should address. Often when we think of the ancient past, and we are well learned in the wonders of the ancient past, we can ask things like, how did the Dogon know of the otherwise invisible to the naked eye star of Sirius B? How did the people of the Andes come to understand the unique pharmacology of the two plants that substantiate the ayahuasca experience if they don't have access to a scientific chemistry lab? How did the deep history of the ancients come to understand things like the precession of the equinoxes without mathematics to bear? How did ancient cultures syncretize their knowledge and their architecture across the world without them being assumably in communication with each other? How do these wonders come to be, and why our modern mind can't comprehend how these things work? Well, a potential answer here is the epistemology of animism, or making oneself available to what is otherwise called the logos, the secret knowledge of the ancient shamans, this voice above or outside of time, that there is something of a guiding voice that is not exclusive and is not selective of a people or a culture. There are certain advantages to say that we are the special ones to only receive this voice outside of time. But in practice and in study, it's shown that it's appeared, if it exists, across the world. And so if this is the case, and perhaps we might assume that those of the ancient past were much more attuned to this voice, and to receive an answer and to not have to ask why. To receive a realization of something, a gift, and we might call this the ancestors. We might call this Great Spirit or Great Mystery gave this to me, or grandmother gave this to me. But it's all the same thing. This voice outside of time, or the superconscious, however we wish to categorize it. So this is a potential answer, not only to the nature of prophecy, but also the nature of knowledge in the ancient world, the inexplicable knowledge of the ancient world. And if this is true, then it compromises Western epistemology, and that just simply means how we know what we know. That there could be an access to knowledge outside of our comprehension, or that we've closed ourselves off to. And this closing off is in part due to this exclusivity, to say that this only happens to special people, that only special people experience ESP, paranormal, or these noetic experiences. And it's also to say that if our culture excludes this activity, if it considers it impossible, impractical, or outright insane, then of course it won't be fed, it won't be grown, it won't be nurtured, and this ability will just atrophy and atrophy and atrophy. If this is the case, then the reality, or the ancient reality at the very least, would be that this is a poetic reality, in the sense that this is a panpsychism, a ether that participates in all things, an akasha that participates in all things, whatever language we want to use to designate it. This is a field of knowledge that is always available in anything. A still mind makes itself available to the voices outside, or to this voice outside of time. And the clobbered, cloistered mind of modern man would be among the last to receive such a voice. And if this voice is true, might we call it the way? Might we call it God? Might we call it the Tao? If this voice is true, then it is again indeed everywhere. The ancient world had its fair share of wise men, and these wise men tended to renounce civilization. This tendency is embodied by the archetype of the hermit. Archetypally speaking, the hermit represents solitude and self-determination, this spiritual maturation that becomes of us, one who has put in the honest work and discipline to bring about a wisdom, to bring about an enlightenment, a vision of the world that supersedes the mundane understandings. In mentioning the hermit, one's mind might first go to this early movement in Christianity. However, we can find this religiously in Taoism, in Sikhism, in Hinduism, and Buddhism. So this is most notably archetypal. It is not distinct to a spiritual tradition. But I have just noted the major religions. In truth, this idea goes way back to the animistic and shamanistic in two different forms. The wise man, or the one that goes off on their own to distill the knowledge of the world into wisdom, is the shaman, the elder, the guiding voice of a people. It should be noted that this role isn't necessarily engendered either. Certain tribes would have exclusively women as shamans, some other tribes would have exclusively men, and some would share the mantle between both. The role of women in this tends to be grab-bagged by the term crone or witch, and that got dragged through the mud so substantially that now the only positive verbiage in relation to this subject tends to be relegated for men. If I say witch, there are certain associations, and if I say wizard, then there are very different associations. But if you are a follower of the course, then you know that the role of women's wisdom in the ancient past has been honored here substantially. With that being said, and regardless, in this ancient animistic past, we had rites of passage. There are two important things to mention about this rite of passage. One, everybody is put on a hermitage of sorts. There is a means to come to your spiritual understanding, your power animal. This quest that you are put on is a dedicated time to further your spiritual maturation or your self-awareness or your awareness of the greater world. In this way, everybody, or next to everybody, depending on the culture, would benefit from the hermitage. And then on the other hand, this hermitage would inform the culture as to who ought be the shaman, or who ought be trained for that later, more secluded role. This is to say that each and every culture, in its own ways, in its own idiosyncrasies, acknowledged the importance of finding yourself, finding your place in this world, and seeking wisdom for the benefit of all people. However, when it comes to the more academic or traditional understanding of this subject, the role of the hermit begins in Hinduism. It begins in India. And in truth, there is no way to trace when this began exactly. Because we're asking then, when does aestheticism begin? When does yoga begin? These spiritual practices would give us an indication as to when the first hermits left, so to speak. And in that, we could say around the 6th century BCE, we could say around 1000 BCE, but nonetheless, it's tied to this change in relating to spirituality within India. As opposed to looking outward to give sacrifices or to placate certain deities through ritual, we are instead changing it to look inward. This is an inversion of the world. Instead of serving the village, you serve the wild. Instead of serving marriage and seeking that sort of love, you seek celibacy. Instead of seeking productivity for the economy, you seek to renounce that and remove yourself from it. In addition, you renounce stability. You embrace the transience of life, the transience of seasons, the transience of where you are. Life becomes much more like a dream. Where you'll end up is unknown to you. All of this in the aspiration to achieve an inner wisdom as opposed to seeking those external glamours of the world. But this practice isn't for everybody. This is purely for the highest class of people. If you were a merchant, if you were a farmer, this would not be culturally afforded to you. If you were a Brahmin, then you were encouraged a life of the priesthood. But as opposed to that life, or after you're done serving that life, you had a cultural modality that allowed you hermitage. This partially explains the story of Siddhartha Buddha. As a prince, Siddhartha would have had more of a cultural backing, more of a cultural right to forego society, to undertake the aesthetic journey. And of course, his works would go on to inspire Buddhism. Anyhow, this cultural trope of the hermit was not uniform. This was a free rein for those that were of the appropriate gender and for those that were of appropriate class. They would go about this in many ways. Some would wander. Some would stay in the same place. Some were previously married, and some were lifelong practitioners. You can see already how this previous animistic trope is starting to shape itself into monasticism or into monkhood. For India, though, this isn't rebellion. There's a hint of rebellion in it, but it's very much structured in the society that it's blossoming out from. But society is acknowledging the importance of the spiritual quest, or dedicating your life to unveiling the hidden mystery, to dedicate the rest of your days to unveiling the secret wisdoms of the world, whether purely for yourself or to come back and share that with others. But this is all just one example, the oldest example of the religious hermit. The next part of the story takes place in China, and this is much more traceable when it comes to dating when exactly this happens. And this has everything to do with the development of Confucianism in China. This is all taking place relatively around 500 BCE. As a very simplistic way of putting it, Confucianism will bring society more to the forefront, a rulership, the responsibility of people to uphold the laws and the rules of society. Subsequently, on the opposite end of that comes Taoism, which will be that rebellion and that anarchy, or that re-embracing of that natural way of living that is obviously not what society is cooking up. So in this way, these first hermits were rebels. They wished to move away from the machinations of society. They saw its error from the gates. So this trope of hermits in Asia didn't necessarily begin religiously. It became spiritually associated in time, but at first it was a rejection. Those who rejected became the wise men, became the wise man on the mountain, the people that you would seek if you were looking for wisdom. Similar to India, Taoism has a history of records that show people in substantial positions of power renouncing those positions of power to become essentially a nobody, lost in the mountains, lost in the woods somewhere, to seek study or to seek stillness and virtue, as opposed to wealth, as opposed to power. These monks, these hermits, felt that the world was inherently corrupted by this pursuit of society. It went too far. And one could argue that Japan had a similar motivation for its movements. This happened much later, though. The figures disagree. It could be around the 6th century, it could be around the 7th or 8th, but nonetheless, Hermitage in Japan seemed to be inspired by the syncretism between Buddhism, Taoism, and Shintoism. In its early movements, it seemed to take two different forms. One was the purely wandering, transient sort of hermit, and then there were the mountain hermits. And these mountain hermits tended to create a system or a esoteric tradition that would bring about a monastery or a monkhood. So in this way, you can start to see how the gathering of hermits at a sacred place is what historically creates monasteries. Where before we saw in China how to become a hermit was at first rebellious and then led to spirituality, it seems here in Japan that those two were immediately married, in that the religious and spiritual journey was the rebellion. It's curious to see how these three philosophies played off of each other. If Buddhism was purely to play here, then this is relieving yourself of attachments. And in order to do so, seclusion is important, or to be around others that are very much like you in this priority. For Shintoism, the sacredness of the mountain and the sacredness of nature would certainly play its part. The animism within Shintoism would have one seek wisdom through speaking with the spirits or being amidst nature. And then lastly, Taoism, where the way, or the genuine, earnest, sincere way that human beings ought to approach living in this world, is divorced from power. It acknowledges that power will never satiate the human being. In its philosophy, the only way to reach contentment or fulfillment would be in following the way. And this tends to be through stillness, through renunciation of what is considered success in this world. Quote, "Knowing myself and the world, I have no ambitions and do not mix in the world. I seek only tranquility. I rejoice in the absence of grief." But to better round out this greater narrative of ours, we have to acknowledge the West. And one could argue the precursors or the inspiration for this later Hermeticism in, for instance, Jesus or Diogenes. But classically, traditionally, this is in the 3rd century, and it's the Christians escaping Roman rule. In this, the world was fundamentally corrupted, or our people were not able to exist in the way that we find true and sincere in this system. Thus, we will disband. We will escape this society, go into the desert, and become hermits. And that is the etymology of the word hermit. Eremites means the person who lives in the desert, thus inspired by the first ones who chose to do so. Though this word also means stillness and tranquility or solitude, thus attributes of the desert, generally speaking. Strangely, the word monk comes from monos, which means one or alone. But nonetheless, eremites, hermit, and monachos, monk, share the same root. They both come from the same verbiage or from the same descriptors: stillness, tranquility, solitude, and alone. This monos quality, or this one, being one quality, is one who is set apart from the rest, and the one who deals directly with divinity or God or transcendental essence. These early monks were particularly known for their hesychism, which is an uninterrupted prayer. This almost lulling into a trance-like state, which seems rather reminiscent of a mantra. This hesychism will move into mysticism and will inspire the unique forms of worship found in Greek Orthodox Christianity. But yet again, this root here in hesychism is to be still. So let's take some time with this reoccurring motif of stillness. If we're Taoist, if we're a hermit in the Hindu tradition, regardless of all of these different geographies, there is this similar vein of stillness, renunciation, and stillness. If the world wants you busied, if it wants your mind clobbered full with responsibilities, anxieties, then there is no greater act of rebellion other than to become still, to take in that yin, to not have to produce, be productive, but instead live, be in the moment, so to speak. Embrace the sensation of the present. This is antithetical to society. No matter which geography we're oriented to, this is the uniform rebellion. In this case of Christianity, this initial hermitage is a rebellion against the state or against the empire or against Babylon, so to speak. And so there, the choice is very obvious. We can't fight this right now. There doesn't seem to be enough of us. So what we'll do instead is we'll do everything that we can to separate ourselves from perpetuating this structure and this system. Many of these hermits would go on to become saints, would go on to be prolific speakers in the history of Christianity. Some of them would become ferrymen, others would become gatekeepers. As Christianity rose in power, it embraced this act of hermitage as a very feasible means toward salvation. For a good long while, the works of the hermit were viewed as more important than what was done by the community. In a world that is much more spiritually inclined, the one who is dedicatedly praying on behalf of all people is doing the Lord's work, is benefiting everybody in ways that they can't even perceive. And this is by no means unique to Christianity. These monasteries act as satellites or vessels of those dedicated to keeping up reality or keeping up the status quo of the world, keeping up the spirits of all peoples. To see the wise man on the mountain performing a ritual for the whole town, only these sorts of people would dedicate in that fashion. Most individuals that would call themselves religious are much more selfish than that, interestingly. So the history of the hermit in Christianity lasts roughly around 1,000 years, because by the time the Middle Ages come about, there are a number of thieves, vagabonds, muddying the waters of those who would otherwise be considered saintly. So the church moves to bring all the hermits in, to no longer encourage this as an act of salvation. But now you must be reined in and go to the monastery. You must become a monk. And really, the only difference is whether you're doing this thing with other people or whether you're going at it alone. And such is observed across the religious board here. This is also true as it's developed in the East. You find monasteries with a number of monks, not individual hermits. This seems to have dissipated. So in this way, these religions have officially lost the rite of passage motif that came from animism and shamanism. This no longer includes self-individuation. This no longer includes that individual greater enlightenment that seems only to come from solitude, from aloneness. The hermits as an institution was overall done away with in the religious world, with some notable exceptions, of course, most notably in Hinduism. So society then no longer offers this release valve, this means to dismiss or cultural acceptance of this individuated spiritual journey. But it's curious because as religions seem to be closing the books on this motif, on this archetype, then comes the wizard. Oddly, as the hermits were being reined in by the Western Church, the first accounts of wizards start to be put to paper. This is a very curious trope, but let's first deal with its etymology. Wizard or wizard is the wise. Wis is wise, so it's literally just a wise man. But distinctly, there seems to be a more, yet again, rebellious attitude to the wizard, in the sense that here he doesn't fit in to any set dogma. It seems the wizard is genuinely out for knowledge, and that's the distinction. It's more scholastic, academic, or magically oriented, that of which isn't condoned by the power structures at the time. Knowledge was hard to come by, and literacy was hard to come by. So the individual that was very sincere and directed towards this aim of going out to foreign places, learning the many ways, learning the many practices of very foreign cultures, and bringing back this knowledge, but still yet relatively not participating in the world, being apart from the world. And thus, the depictions of wizards throughout the Middle Ages are wily. Whether they're working with angels or whether they're conjuring devils, how to put them in a box seemed like it was always changing in the public psyche. There's a few instances that we can kick up here. For instance, let's just say an earnest Christian was not pleased with how Christianity had become a power structure, and they found that contradictory to the very nature of it. What would they do? Well, if they could no longer be a hermit and left alone in this way, they might just seek other ways of seeking. But you could also argue that the wizard's power, per se, is in the fact that people believed that these individuals were very powerful, because they were mysterious, because they knew of things that normal people had no means of contact with. Nobody else was dedicated to this realm of the world. But also, culturally, there survived this value of the wise person, to value the elder, to look to someone who knows for guidance, to seek someone who knows for guidance. So maybe you can see why this trope of the wizard is so fascinating. It's fascinating because it doesn't meet classification very well. The wizard isn't necessarily aligned with any creed. The wizard is alone, almost like a hermit or alchemist, and seldom works amidst others. In the archetype of the wizard is mystery, the ineffable, and the unknowable. They tease at that in a way that religious traditions have not allowed for in a very long time. But that is the initial kernel of all of this. The rite of passage, or the shamanic journey in seeking the great mystery, the great spirit, or that which we can never fully know, and to plunge into those mercurial waters and to dig up something that has never been discovered before. It's also amazing that the trope of the wizard got through the burning times relatively unscathed and carried over into public media without any really harsh negative associations. You might also notice how curiously transcendentalism plays into all this. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau seeking the oversoul by leaving society, becoming a recluse, lost in nature somewhere, finding God, finding divinity through being alone in the world, rejecting society in order to seek that mysterious thing. By modern standards, it would seem to imply that we figured it all out and that this seeking is done, that the wonder is no longer worth seeking, that it's all been done. And so history really is over in this way if there's no longer a mystery to seek. We're in a curious time in this regard as well, because so many people are involuntarily becoming isolated, hermitized, disenfranchised. What was monastic orders in the past are now gaining numbers of individuals that have nowhere else to go. They are being pushed out of society more forcibly, economically, whether they are left completely alone and without contact of anybody in the world other than through the internet, or whether they are just plainly disbanding and they're not posting it on social media. When we are pushed to this isolation, it brings a dark night of the soul. No hermit in all of this session here did this kind of move voluntarily. in a genuine way. They did it out of necessity. They were forced to, or in their mind, there was no other option. And this wasn't something where it's going to be relieving. This is something that is going to be taxing. And I'm going to put myself to the fire of isolation, of loneliness, of reining in myself, of making a withstanding commitment to seek the wonder, to look for new answers that are not provided by convention and tradition. After all, to find yourself, you must be by yourself. To know thyself, you need to be in your own company. To achieve stillness allows for this company to speak. But we should take notice here. We no longer have a cultural space for the elder, for the wise man. We don't prize this archetype any longer. We don't prize this function in our own lives any longer. We prize the opposite of stillness, in effect. By our perception, knowledge became a commodity, and thus its value lessened. And wisdom was next to forgotten. So in that, you might ask, where then are the wise men? Where then are these elders of actual accomplished wisdom? And in truth, I think it's pertinent to point out that even historically speaking, we don't know where they've ever been. They aren't necessarily the types to make themselves known. The only ones that we've known about are the ones who have made themselves known. And so, how many nameless people have contributed to our past in such substantial ways that we will never be able to perceive it? And in the same way, in the modern day, how many nameless, wise people, hermits, are there that are holding up the candle of this hope, of this wonder, of this seeking? But the record shows that to become like this is in itself a rebellion from society. Whether it's a small clan of people and an individual knows that they must go on their own way to find this out, or whether there is an oppressive government in the ancient past or in the modern that would not allow for this seeking. Nonetheless, you go out and do it. You find your own way. You go into the desert, the woods, or you carve your space in a cave somewhere. This is an earnest part of the history of humanity. This is a function that we perform amidst this society. In this archetype, we have to acknowledge the power of abstaining, of stepping away from a situation, of reaching towards stillness, accepting solitude. This is not something that you will to do. You aren't jumping for joy to undergo this sort of experience, but you know it needs to be done. It's a looming feeling. Renouncing entertainments, renouncing connections with people that you sincerely care about, renouncing success, and choosing instead to walk down that barren road, to be made raw in the eyes of the world, to make mistakes, to fumble and to be emotionally ripped open, to look at yourself and feel those things that you otherwise never allowed yourself to feel. And in this graceless approach, you achieve wisdom. And that wisdom, those secrets paid for by your suffering, by your sacrifice, is what makes the candle, is what makes the torch they're holding, is wonder in this world. To wander brings wonder, and to have wonder brings fascination, hope for tomorrow, a promise of a future beyond all this darkness. This world needs to wonder again.
But our culture has been reduced to the grossly commercial. Our life activities have become plastic, vicarious, and false to our genuine needs.
And the Logos was a teaching voice, an inner prompting, a speaking thing. And the goal of religious life, the goal of the whole and well-lived life was to come into connection with this thing called the Logos.